Howdy, I'm Jam. So, two things. You'll note right off the bat, yes, I look like Quagmire, which is why Quagmire is out and joining me today in this video. Giggity. Second, you may also notice my hat. This is a rather old hat. I've had it for decades now. The reason I'm wearing it is, as you can see, I haven't washed my hair in a couple days, so it's kind of all over the place, more so than usual. So, why not? Thought I'd wear this bad boy and do my best to look cool. Look cool, me. Anyway, I'm really excited. I mean, I'm always excited about these things, but I'm also really excited today because we are going to finally talk about one of my favorite artists of all times. And I know I say that about a lot of different people, like I did with Grant Morrison, because he is, but alongside Grant Morrison, there's another one of my favorite artists, and his name, well, you probably heard of him, and you may already guess who he is just by looking at today's individual issue. Today, we're going to be talking about Neil Gaiman. I know, I'm like pumped because I struggled so hard to figure out what is going to be the first Neil Gaiman comic book that we're going to do on this channel. And that actually gets into some interesting concepts about the idea of observation can ultimately impact the observed, because I understand that if I'm reading books with the understanding that I'm going to talk about them on video, does that determine which books I'm reading? And of course it does, but then at the same time I'm already reading Neil Gaiman all the time anyway, so it doesn't matter, and now I'm just rambling incoherently. So, why is Neil Gaiman so important to me? Well, I mean, for a whole host of reasons. When I was a teenager, the movie Coraline came out by Laika Productions, and if you've never seen Coraline, go see it. It is just a visually stunning movie, and it's an amazing story. But alongside that, I had kind of briefly become aware of Neil Gaiman through a really important book by the title of American Gods. Now, I'm going to unplug my cell phone here for just a second so I can show you here. When I say Neil Gaiman is an important author to me, I do truly mean that. You can see just from that collection of books alone the number of Neil Gaiman texts that I have in my actual collection. Now, I'm trying to off center, but that's okay. I can fix it during the next break. Whatever the case, you can see from that collection alone, ever since reading American Gods, I was left spellbound, because there was such a wealth and depth of imagination and passion and conviction for stories. Neil Gaiman, in just about everything I've ever read of him, he feels so intimately connected to his work, and he has so much passion in it. And I'm going to just gush ad nauseum about how much I love Neil Gaiman, but just to put this in perspective as well, again, as always, I have to show off. If this doesn't demonstrate my level of conviction for how much I love Neil Gaiman as an artist, I don't really know anything else that will. I have, for instance, a hardback copy of Ocean at the End of the Lane, signed by Neil Gaiman. I also happen to have a first edition copy hardback of Norse Mythology, which I can't recommend enough. Again, also signed by Neil Gaiman. And in fact, today's graphic novel, which is the first Neil Gaiman book we're doing, Signal to Noise, signed by Neil Gaiman. There aren't very many authors I would spend this much time and energy, and realistically speaking too, money on. But Neil Gaiman is worth it, because again, like I noted before, there's a passion to his writing that I really appreciate. He loves stories, he loves storytelling. And so, looking at Gaiman himself, and looking at what book of Gaiman's to touch on, immediately I thought Sandman. But at the time I started doing these again, I had recently come in contact, or I had recently discovered a book that's actually really hard to track down. Again, Signal to Noise. This book is actually out of print. And yes, this is a first edition hardback. I wish I could say I went through my local comic book shop for this, but alas, I had to feed the beast and go through Amazon in order to track it down, because my shop couldn't order it, and I couldn't really find it in very many libraries. So I paid a lot for it, but this is a prized gem of my collection because it's a story of Neil Gaiman's that's really hard to track down. So I thought that seems like the most perfect idea to start on with Neil Gaiman. But then I also read a little bit about the story and what it was about. The plot line of Signal to Noise is that there is a famous film director who is diagnosed with terminal cancer right before he is about to make his final film, or his next film, which is going to be about a small European village. It doesn't specify where in Europe. Author or the director says he likes to keep that idea vague. And the village is set in the year 999. Now, immediately somebody might go, so, why is that important? And why is this important to creativity? And, well, this. Well, the year 999 was important because Neil Gaiman had been reading a lot about Europe during that time period, and at that time period, Europe was held by a lot of what's known as millenarianism. Now, I kind of doubt that you've heard that word before. I keep seeing a shadow over my face. I'm trying to... Not that you need to see my face anyway. But, what is millenarianism? What is that word? Why is it important? Well, I wanted to make sure I had like a really functional definition for y'all, so I looked it up online, and I had been taught originally that millenarianism was more or less the belief that the world is coming to an end, which is accurate, but it's also slightly skewed, because a functional definition is the doctrine or belief in a future, and typically imminent, 1,000-year age of blessedness beginning with or culminating in the second coming of Christ. It is central to the teaching of groups such as Plymouth Brethren, Adventists, Mormons, and Jehovah's Witnesses, belief in a future golden age of peace, justice, and prosperity. Likewise, Merriam-Webster provides two definitions which say a belief in the millennium of Christian prophecy, and then two, belief in a coming ideal society, and especially one created by revolutionary action. Those definitions are important because it may seem to a contemporary viewer, well, of course people in the year 999 thought that the world was going to come to an end, you know? They were a past society. That was the Dark Ages, which I really hate that term for a whole host of reasons, but we'll stay away from that for the time being. Naturally, people in the past would not have been as well educated and cultured as us. Only problem is, I'm 31 years old, and I remember the year 1999, and I remember a word, Y2K. You might have heard of it. The thought process was computers at the time could not handle a shift from the year 1999 to 2000, and the very second that the year 2000 came into being, all computers everywhere would crash. It would be the end of society. 2000 came. And 20 years later, we're still here. Also, in the year 2012, a bunch of people looked at what they thought was the Aztec calendar, and they came to the conclusion, everything ends at 2012. Therefore, the world is going to end at 2012. And a lot of people lost their minds. Because in the year 2011, they thought, this is the last year we have on Earth. This is the last year we have on Earth. History Channel did all sorts of documentaries about this. This is kind of side note of where the History Channel began to make its slow descent into, I can't even call it insanity at this point. And everyone was convinced this is going to be the end of the world. 2012 came. 8 years later, we're still here. And now it's 2020. And there are still people who feel that this is going to be the end of the world. Now, based on the way 2020 is going, there may be some plausibility to the fear, but at the same time, we have to recognize that even in our current age, there are still people that are convinced that our world is coming to an end. There's just some sort of drive in us as a species to think this is the end of our time. And so the argument, well, of course people in 999 thought that way. They were old. They were an ancient society or an older society. They didn't know better. 8 years ago, people looked at flimsy evidence and hearsay evidence about the Aztecs and thought the world was coming to an end. And there's still people today who think this. But again, why is this important to comics? Why is this important to this comics? Well, again, the director of this movie is tackling the issue of millenarianism and the sort of concept of the end of the world right as his own world is ending. And it's really important to kind of understand what is that topic. And I wanted to bring in a quote from a book that I read several years ago for a Reformation-era Europe class. It's called The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, Religion, War, Famine, and Death in Reformation Europe, by Andrew Cunningham and Ole Peter Grell. This is a brilliant book, and I would absolutely recommend it if you get the chance. It's a really interesting insight into how the apocalyptic mindset really governed the Reformation in Europe. And I wanted to read one brief passage because I think it's predominantly relevant to the topic we're looking at. The introduction, it says, "More than any other period of European history, the 16th and early 17th centuries were characterized by apocalyptic expectations, eschatological speculations, and millenarian dreams." This is a very academic book at times, but it's still pretty readable. To contemporaries, it felt as though they were living through the last days. This preoccupation with the end of the world, the end of time, and the arrival of the 1,000-year kingdom of Christ was rooted in deep religious, social, political, economic, and, above all, the demographic crises of the time. The year 1500, being a half millennium, was greeted as a year of special apocalyptic significance. Even the Roman Curia, which actively discouraged apocalyptic speculation, had announced 1500 as a special jubilee year, a holy year where pilgrimage would be particularly rewarded. The increase in apocalyptic preaching, claiming that the arrival of Antichrist was imminent, in fact obliged the Fifth Lateran Council in 1513 to forbid preaching about such matters. In the year 1500, people were so convinced that their world was coming to an end simply because there was an arrangement of numbers in the year. And again, 1500 is only a couple of centuries after 999. But to really drive this point home, during the late 1400s, an artist by the name of Albrecht Durer constructed or made a wood print. This is essentially like just any artistic print, except that you sort of cast the ink on wood and then print it on paper. Also want to do a small side note. I'm going to provide you an important image of Durer's work, care of my lovely mother, whose home is mostly filled with paperbacks and art history books. Hi, Mom. Thanks for letting me borrow the book. This book, The World of Durer, 1471 to 1528, also please forgive my terrible German, has a lot of images in it. But the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse employs or relies steadily upon one image of Durer's work as a kind of, microcosm of all this sentiment of what was happening. And that was the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. Again, this notion that the world was ending had come so full front, full center, one of those full words in this particular wood print. And you can see just in terms of the line work, the emotional resonance of the piece, and just the attention to detail. This work shocked people, but more importantly, it resonated with people. Again, what does this have to do with signal to noise? What does this have to do with comics? This book is important because the end of things resonates so much with us as a species. It's the fundamental part of so many world religions, so many philosophies, so much of the way we live our personal day-to-day lives. Every end is effectively a new beginning. But ends also make us contemplate, what have we done with our time? And that's a really important question because at the end of the day, all we really have in this life is our time and our choices. And so what's really interesting right off the bat to me about the graphic novel Signal to Noise is it's not just a meditation on art. It's a meditation on the idea or the responsibility or even just simply the action of choice and time. So as we move forward in this book, I really hope I've at least kind of created the foundation of the idea that we're really going to be meditating or really exploring how comics can dig into the idea of what is our end and how do we go about actively making choices before this end, and then what do those choices mean to the summation of our lives. All right. I just spent 15 minutes talking about the end of the world before we even got to the comic book itself, so this is probably going to be a little bit more of a longer video than normal, but it's Neil Gaiman. He's worth your time. And hopefully I'm worth your time too. But let's focus a lot more on Neil Gaiman. Now, like I said a minute ago, the plot line of Signal to Noise is that a director has an idea for his next movie, which is that he's going to tell the story of a village in the year 999 on the last day of that year. So essentially what he's doing at that moment, or his desire, is to explore how human beings would react on that last final day of the supposed world. So he sells it to a group of reporters. Let me find the exact page. I was literally just looking at it before I started filming again. Oh, God, this artwork is so beautiful. He responds to a group of reporters by observing, the next film is about the end of the world. When asked, oh, does that mean it's a science fiction movie? He's like, no, it's about the end of the world that never was. It's about the end of the millennia. And then you'll observe here, we have a nice little 12-panel page, or technically speaking, a 16-panel page. There's a lot of that going in this book, but I'll talk about that in a little bit. But what's really interesting is the last final line, a reporter asks him how long he has to live. We see the reporter's head turned into a bird, aka like a predator, like a hawk or a vulture perhaps, and the director simply says, a couple of months. I really like that because it's really playing at that moment of the sort of, he's talking about making a movie about people seeing the end of the world, and then at that moment, a reporter's question predicts his own end. It's a nice little rhetorical trick that's absolutely stunning and gorgeous, and one of the reasons why I love this book so much. But it's also really good opportunity to sort of sum up the plot, because after that press conference, he goes to the doctor's office, or we see him in the doctor's office. We see or get the diagnosis that he's only got a couple months left to live, and at that moment, his active choice is to stop everything. And the remainder of the book then is him sitting in his apartment, basically not doing anything but picturing the movie in his head. And so the reader follows his thought process as he's picturing actors to play in the roles, certain scenes in the movie. He considers, what have I really done with my life? We get occasional interruptions by his friends, families, people who lived across the hall from him than his apartment, and these moments kind of interrupt his process. But most of the real meat of Signal to Noise is focused on this character thinking about the movie inside of his head. Which gets me to an important point. Signal to Noise. I really didn't think about that title. I figured it was just some sort of interesting concept or just an amusing title. Because I often don't think about titles as much as I should. But right before this video started, I thought maybe, my iPad glows up, I was like, maybe Signal to Noise means something relevant and important. I actually looked up the definition, and Signal to Noise is actually a technical term. Signal-to-noise ratio is a measure used in science and engineering that compares the level of desired signal to the level of background noise. SNR is defined as the ratio of signal power to noise power, often expressed in decibels. A ratio higher than 1 to 1 indicates more signal than noise. So what does that mean for art? Well, I actually think it again demonstrates one of the really interesting significance of this book, because Dave McKean, the artist, who, if you haven't heard of Dave McKean, what is wrong with you? I'm kidding, but only so much. Dave McKean, if you have never heard of him, is a longtime collaborator with Neil Gaiman. He's arguably one of the most important artists working today, and he is an amazing comics artist. He's actually done several collections of his own called Pictures That Tick and Cages, which I would absolutely love to talk about sometime in the future. He's also, fun fact, the man who has illustrated the cover of literally every issue of Sandman. This book here, the collected Sandman covers, aka dust covers, is an entire work of nothing but all the images Dave McKean made for every single issue of Sandman. This is a gorgeous collection, and it's absolutely worth your time and money, trust me. But Dave McKean is unique because of the fact that in terms of the iconic versus photorealistic art structure that we observed in Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, Dave McKean has no set description. Or it's near impossible to track him down because just about every single one of his compositions is a combination of photography, mixed media, hand-drawn sketches. Sometimes he will employ abstract imagery. There's no real clear consensus to McKean's art style. It's just, let's take 14 different pictures and make it into some kind of coherent narrative. So what does that have to do with Signal to Noise? What's really unique about this graphic novel is that while the reader is largely observing the thoughts of the director, we're receiving sometimes lots of incoherent imagery. For example, in this passage here, the director wakes up from having a nightmare, and then we see this snake skeleton, which then precedes several scattered lines on the graph that we immediately determine are an X-ray. He's suddenly at the doctor's office. The reader of Dave McKean and Neil Gaiman in Signal to Noise is regularly challenged. And this is really important when we consider the narrative thread of this book, is because Dave McKean is trying to show a lot of noise to the viewer. And then Gaiman's writing is creating a lot of experimentation about what is art, what is life, why do I do absolutely anything? And the reader is continually exposed to a lot of play in terms of panel structure, panel layouts, assuming sometimes that there are panels at all. One of the unique things about Dave McKean is that he doesn't feel comfortable squeezing his work into a box, or, as you can observe just in this whole page structure here, this frame could potentially be a panel, but then the contents of the interior spill out well past the page. Likewise, even though we have the 6-panel layout here, we can still determine that there are effects bleeding outside of these panels. Asking the question to the reader at that moment, why do we have these panels? What images are important for the reader to focus? So if we go back to the concept of signal-to-noise ratio, how much signal are we actually getting versus noise? And again, why is that important? Well, in terms of our day-to-day life, we have to consider and remember how much noise we receive versus how much signals we receive. Or maybe put it another way, how much attention do we really focus on little minute things? There's so much interaction in our contemporary existence, whether it be watching videos on YouTube, getting texts from loved ones, friends, getting robocalls. God, are those not obnoxious? I'm always terrified one of them's going to interrupt this recording process. It's a nightmare. How much TV we watch, how much music we listen to. There's so much exposure. So at that moment, how do we determine what is the real meat of our lives? And again, that's really crucial when we consider the fact that our lives are terribly short. And so what we make out of it is really important, really interesting. I love this one-page spread because, again, the preceding page, we get a couple of word balloons of the doctor and the director talking set over a couple of blurry images of an X-ray. It may not seem terribly important, but then from the detail of his body, more importantly, the detail of a flaw in his body, specifically a tumor, we then move to just a simple image of him sitting in a chair in his apartment reading, which I note, if you actually read the passage, he says, I've been doing a lot of reading, watching TV late at night when there's nothing on, and the repetition of the adverts becomes a mantra, a refrain, singing images held in time. I don't answer the phone or reply to letters. I don't have much time. One page is enough to just sum up what the story is in a nutshell. Because later on in the text, he's visited regularly by friends, people telling him, you should be writing, you should be recording something. Let me see if I can't find... No, of course I can't find that. But he's regularly interrupted by close associates who are saying, you should be working on your movie. But he's not, because at this moment he's far more content to let the art exist inside of his mind. Now, moving on, the viewer may at first seem to think that this book is absolutely nothing but random, abstract thought. I assure you, promise you, it's not. A later passage in the book actually shows that the reader actually gets some glimpses of the movie inside of the director's mind. This page here is actually a shot of several villagers inside of the movie. The director gives us a glimpse that these villagers go to a mountaintop. They abandon their village and go to the mountaintop, believing that as soon as the year 1000 comes in, they will be either ascended up into heaven or they will have to prepare for the imminent demise of all humanity. So this passage here One is a beautiful layout. It also gives you an idea into the way that Dave McKean can just present some of the most gorgeous images and at the same time haunting images that they'll probably ever read in their life. But looking at just this top panel, you can kind of see the way Neil Gaiman and Dave McKean, and I'll go ahead and let you pause it, by the way, so that you can actually read the words on this page. Did you pause it? You're not pausing. You know, I try so hard to make these entertaining for you and helpful to you, but do you try? No. I'm offended. All right, last chance. All right, you're back. So you can see by that passage, by using the examples of the self-flagellating martyrs, and by using people's panic and hysteria, he's tying into the idea of people's reactions to the end. Why is that important? Well, again, the director is dying slowly, painfully from cancer. He has a tumor that has metastasized, aka spread the cancer into his bloodstream so that it moves throughout his body and grows throughout all of his body, making it pretty much impossible to treat. Now, that's a whole entire video unto itself about how cancer works, and I definitely encourage you to look at it. As a child of two grandparents who ultimately died to cancer, the affliction is medically fascinating, if not emotionally heartbreaking. Moving to the content of the plot, what's unique here is that on the very next page, again, you can kind of see the story of the villagers interrupted by the artist. Again, we see pain and suffering and torment of these villagers, while the director here is calmly, carefully contemplating the way these people are going to die. Now, he's narrating the events inside of his mind, and this passage is really interesting to me because it says, "The baby begins to cry. In the village, a drunken cripple is singing in the snow, noise, just noise. And ask yourself, if they believe the end is coming, that their world is coming to an end, why are they doing this? Why are they still screaming and whipping and pissing and living and joking and waiting? And I ask myself, why am I writing a film I will never make, writing something no one will ever see? The world is always ending for someone." It's a good line. He then continues in the last 4 panels of the page, just a continual description of the baby begins to cry and the father doing his best to get it to stop. But honestly, after that, there's not much more to this page I really need to just sort of further remind the viewer here about what is really, I would argue, artistically significant about this book, and if I can make this work, humanely significant about this book. Signal to Noise is arguably one of the most beautiful books, or beautiful meditations about life and work that I've ever read, maybe with the exception of this graphic novel here, Day Tripper, which I'll cover in this video, and I've actually done a video of already, but that's for another day. This book, much like Signal to Noise, is a meditation on creativity, life, and death. The question of why does anybody do anything is really the stuff of like Philosophy 101 lectures, but it's still a question worth asking. Why am I making these videos? All of 2 or 3 people will probably watch them. To which case the question is, why not? The hell else am I going to do? Like, watch TV? Ugh, I hate TV. And yet I'm making YouTube videos. You know what? Don't think about it too much. The point is, I feel compelled to make something. And not just videos as well. I make comics on the side. Are they any good? I mean, but I still really love comics. I love making comics. I love talking about comics. I love reading comics. That's most, if not all, of pretty much what I do, except for drinking coffee, too. So, with like 99.9% of my time reading comics and talking about comics and making comics, and then the 1% drinking coffee, actually that might be more like 50% of the time, but that's the way I live my life. And it's come down to that's my choice in life. It's partly an existential decision on some end, and I acknowledge it's an existential decision, but I have to consider what the alternative is. I can simply float through life, passively interacting with media, interacting with other people, trying to just accumulate lots of money, but that's ultimately not what I really want to do with my time. I want my time, what little of it that I have, to be centered around comics, because that's just been my life. Again, as I noted on the very first episode, and as I've noted in several other episodes, ever since my mom read me Calvin and Hobbes when I was a kid, I've just disappeared into comics. And realistically speaking, at times, I actually wrote down the thought earlier, which was that life was a lot more interesting in Calvin and Hobbes than it was in real life. In real life, I wasn't a popular kid at school. I didn't get picked on, but I didn't get noticed for the most part either. I was always terrified that adults were looking at me or trying to expect me to be something. I didn't have very many friends for very long. And in recent weeks and months, I've just gotten out of an emotionally abusive relationship, and I've gone through a divorce, and I've had to completely reevaluate just about every choice I've made in my life. And in that moment, I looked to comics, something that's always brought me joy and happiness. And I thought to myself, I have time. Why not use it? And so that's one of the things I really loved then. To tie it all back and get less heavy, is what I really loved about Signal to Noise. There's so much noise in my life, but comics becomes a kind of signal, something that I can interpret, something that I can find meaning in. Or if not meaning, then just beauty. And that's something that's really profoundly powerful to me about this graphic novel, is how much choice, how much art comes into play. Because art is a way of just enhancing our experience. It's a way of making things seem terribly greater, more profound, or at least trying to find some kind of signal in all of this noise. Hey, you're back. Okay, so, wow, that got kind of heavy all at once. I don't really have too much more to say about this book, because I could go page by page by page and show you just all the beauty that is Signal to Noise in terms of a story, in terms of narrative approach. But I really don't want to do too much more of that, because we're already probably pushing, I forgot he's a bobblehead, we're already pushing a little, I think, close to that 30-minute mark. And so I just wanted to point out another thing that I really love about Signal to Noise. Is something I've already talked about, and that's simply Dave McKean's artwork and approach to structure. Again, Neil Gaiman's writing makes a great chunk of this book, and it's most, if 90%, of what I was just talking a moment ago about how our ends can be the ways of approaching new beginnings. Well, we also have to consider, again, the plot line is a man sitting in his apartment, occasionally taking walks and occasionally talking to friends and making a movie in his head. Visually, that wouldn't be a very interesting movie or really experience. But in the hands of Dave McKean, it becomes something truly brilliant because, again, his art style is such so that we get moment-to-moment transitions in terms of the gutter, but then at the same time, we also get aspect to aspect. We get non sequiturs. We get sometimes pages that don't seem terribly important. With each moment of a chapter, we get illustrations of the inner working of the ear, or representations of, say, viewers watching television. Again, tying into that idea of noise versus signal. If we take a look at this page again, we get a narrative description of the villagers on top of the mountain. We get the martyrs flagellating themselves, whipping themselves. We get the artist sitting alone by himself. But again, it's the way these frames and panels are arranged that a lot of the emotional power and resonance comes to the book. A later passage where the director is talking to Reed, a gentleman who lives across the street from him, is all at once interrupted by the vision of the four horsemen. And in 4 beautiful pages, essentially 4 massive panels, the reader gets to see Dave McKean paint the 4 horsemen in their just full intensity. And whether it be war or death or famine or plague, you can just see the sheer artistic brilliance that is Dave McKean. And I realize I'm kissing a lot of ass here, but I'm always going to kiss Dave McKean's ass because, as you can clearly see, there's a tremendous attention to detail paid into these books, not simply in the fact of making each image simply resonating, but also really playing with it. The reader is often, as you can probably tell already, regularly shown the 16-panel page that is then sort of interrupted by long full pages or else really big individual panels that then kind of swallow up the whole page. What's happening in these moments is narratively, Neil Gaiman is writing the story, but then Dave McKean is also sort of complementing that narrative with a visual language, which is that there's lots of noise, minute interactions that are then sort of broken by large signals. And really what I'm trying to say here is that in these sort of 16-panel spreads, we usually get small moments of dialogue, the director interacting with other people. That's supposed to be representative of day-to-day life, which can be kind of chaotic and noisome, but it's then later on, when we get a little more contemplative, when the director begins to think, that we really begin to find a signal in that noise. We begin to construct meaning. And so, again, the visual layouts of these panels are probably one of the most strongest aspects of the narrative because, again, even if it's just two 16-panel pages, the viewer is given an immense wealth of just visual spectacle. And again, there's so much play taking place in these panels because, again, we have these images down here of Groucho Marx, the director's watching TV. Looking at just this page here, we don't see a lot of moment-to-moments. It feels more like an aspect-to-aspect, but at the same time it kind of is a moment-to-moment because at that moment he's watching TV. And so he's encountering a lot of random individualized signals. Signal to Noise is just a gorgeous book, both in terms of the ideas it's expressing, but visually because of Dave McKean's artwork. And what's, again, really important, as I've demonstrated here, Dave McKean knows how to arrange images, he knows how to arrange panels, so that the reader gets a really contemplative encounter, or a really contemplative interaction with this book. But then it's also sometimes just miraculous. No, I hate that word. Sometimes it's just really fun to just open this book at random and just stare at the pages. Signal to Noise is a gorgeous book from beginning to end. And I don't think I've got too much more to say after that, but I'm positive I do, so give me just 1 second. Alright. I more or less examined this before, but I really wanted to read a small passage from the graphic novel Day Tripper because it has a lot of relevance to the book Signal to Noise. On the opening page of Day Tripper, the very bottom panel, we see the character Bras de Olivia de Amigos, and he's meditating. People die every day. That was the most comforting thought Bras had while all the obituaries he wrote at the newspaper flashed before him. He just realized that even when he's not writing about it, people will keep dying. Isn't it funny how easily people forget about work the moment they leave for the day? Isn't it strange how we always seem to remember the trivial things from our daily lives, yet we so often forget the most important ones? So again, Signal to Noise is a book about life and death. It's about art. It's about our day-to-day lives. It's about the choices we make with our time. There's a lot at play in this book. There's a lot to impact, and I'm really, really, really bloody disappointed that this book is out of print because more people should really read this book than they currently are. Not dumping on Sandman, but if you're a Neil Gaiman fan, you need to read Signal to Noise. But honestly, truthfully, I would argue if you're a human being, you need to read Signal to Noise. Because whether you realize it or not, people are dying every day. Not just from horrible acts of violence, but just because your heart gives out. You drank one too many cups of coffee. It happens. People die, people are born, and we don't really have that much time in our lives. So the choices we make really matter. Which is difficult because there's so many things in life that we have to do rather than what we want to do. But even those decisions set against that reality matter. Because if we choose not to do what we have to do, our life is going to be adversely affected by it, as are the people around us. There's so much more to say about life in general, but that's for a philosopher, and I'm not a philosopher. I'm just some nerd with a master's degree who likes to talk about comics on YouTube to all of 3 people. Hello, 3 people. So, what is the final summation? The final summation is this is a brilliant book about life, and one man trying to understand what he's really done with his life and why, instead of doing other things with his time, he made art. He made movies. And movies are such, at times, an ephemeral media. Again, one experiences a film by typically, or at least in a more traditional fashion, watching movies on a large screen in a darkened theater. You watch the movie, and then all too quickly, it's over. I would argue the similar thing can be said sometimes of comic books and books, period. Art can be such an ephemeral existence. Sometimes it's easy for these books, sometimes that we read mountains of at a time, or perhaps only just two or three over the course of a year, can seem like just noise in our day-to-day lives. And what's, again, really crucial about this book is asking ourselves, the choices of books that we read, the choices we make on a day-to-day basis, how much do they matter? What are the choices that we make that have real signals to our lives? And what are the choices that are just noise? Food for thought. Okay, I'm going to end it there. Thank you so much, so much for your indulgence. I hope you have observed me trying to just contain all of just the cool thoughts and ideas and opinions I have about Signal to Noise. I love this book so much. I love Neil Gaiman and Dave McKean so much. So, where do you track down a copy of Signal to Noise? Because, like I said, I tried to order this from my local comic book shop, but they didn't have it. Well, not every comic book shop in America is my local comic book shop. You might be able to track down, if not a hardback copy of this book, then maybe a paperback copy of this book. The publisher of this book is Dark Horse, so you might try their website as well. And Neil Gaiman has a website where he has a list of basically all of his books, both in terms of like fiction, picture books, novels, films, graphic novels. He's done so much. But that's how actually I stumbled across Signal to Noise. So you might be able to track down a copy of it through his website, but definitely check out your local comic book shop first, because comics are awesome and comic shops are really hurting right now, and comic book shops are awesome. But if they don't have it, don't forget to check out your local public library, because they probably have it, or they might be able to get it to you through interlibrary loan. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe, not just because that's the thing I'm supposed to say on YouTube, but because it actually does help me in terms of getting more people to watch, and then also knowing that, hey, somebody out there is watching and enjoying this. So let me know what you think of this video in the comment section below. Suggest other comics that you think would be really cool or interesting for me to read, or at the very least put up here on this little stand that I'm doing. I might try to make this a permanent thing. I might not. Who knows? And I guarantee you there will be more Neil Gaiman books, because this oversized book is actually one of 3 sort of large Dave McKean collaborations Neil Gaiman has done that I intend to actually cover on this channel, though at the moment I'm reading Marvel 1602. That might be the next Neil Gaiman book. It might not. I don't know. Whatever the case, thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Go read some comics.